There is something most people misunderstand about the empath personality early in life. They assume sensitivity is fragility. They assume emotional depth means vulnerability without strength. They look at the empath, especially when they're young, and see someone who feels too much, trusts too easily, absorbs too deeply, and breaks too often. And for a while, even the empath may believe that story. But what looks like weakness in the beginning is often the early formation of a very unusual kind of power. Because many empaths do not begin life in emotional ease. They begin in tension, in unpredictability, in environments where reading the emotional atmosphere was not optional but necessary. They learned to scan facial expressions before they could explain why. They sensed shifts in tone before anyone else noticed something was wrong. They became highly attuned to contradiction, what people said versus what they actually felt. And while others were simply moving through life, the empath was studying human behavior at a level most people never consciously reach. Now here's where this becomes important. What we call emotional pain, when endured consciously, often becomes perception. And perception over time becomes wisdom. That difficult childhood, that repeated misunderstanding, that constant experience of feeling too much, it doesn't just wound an empath, it trains them quietly, invisibly. It forces an internal development that many people postpone for decades or avoid altogether, because pain has a way of asking deeper questions. Who can I trust? Why do people hurt others? What is real beneath appearances? What protects peace? What actually matters? And the empath, unlike many personalities, doesn't just ask those questions intellectually. They live inside them. They wrestle with them. They search for answers, not in abstract theories, but in lived emotional reality. That changes a person. This is why many empaths appear unusually wise later in life. Not because they were handed wisdom, but because suffering demanded it from them. Think about what happens psychologically when someone repeatedly survives betrayal, disappointment, exclusion, or emotional chaos. One possibility is bitterness, but another possibility, and this is where the empath often evolves differently, is refinement. They begin to distinguish noise from truth, performance from sincerity, charm from character, attention from love, and these distinctions are forms of intelligence. Most people think intelligence is measured by what you can calculate, but there is another intelligence born through hardship, the ability to recognize patterns in human nature. Empaths often develop that early, and what begins as hyper-awareness, sometimes even anxiety, can mature into extraordinary discernment. The child who had to read danger in a room becomes the adult who can read motives. The person who once overanalyzed everyone's emotions becomes the person who understands complex human dynamics. Instinctively, the one who was wounded by deception becomes the one rarely fooled by it again. That is not weakness evolving. That is sensitivity becoming calibrated power. And here is something even deeper. Struggle often strips empaths of superficial ambitions earlier than others. They tend to confront existential questions younger. While others may spend years pursuing status, approval, or image, empaths often become disillusioned with those things sooner because they've already seen how empty appearances can be. That disillusionment can feel painful in youth, but later it becomes liberation, because when you stop worshiping what is shallow, you begin building on what is real, and power built on what is real lasts. This is why later in life many empaths possess a gravity others can feel. It is not loud, it is not performative, it is not dominance, it is depth. And depth carries authority. People trust them because they sense they are speaking from something earned, not borrowed, earned, through heartbreak, through observation, through surviving things that force them inward. And there is enormous strength in people who have gone inward and returned with understanding. This is what the world often misses when it misjudges the empath in the early chapters. It mistakes sensitivity for unfinished strength, when in reality, sensitivity is often strength in formation. Because to feel deeply and still remain compassionate is strength. To be hurt and still choose wisdom over vengeance is strength. To endure confusion and keep searching for truth is strength. And perhaps greatest of all, to turn suffering into understanding instead of becoming hardened by it, that is rare strength. That is transformative strength. The empath's early pain often creates what philosophers have spoken about for centuries, the examined life. And the examined life produces something extraordinary. It produces people who are difficult to manipulate, difficult to deceive, difficult to intimidate, because they have already wrestled with deeper things. And people who have faced deeper things are rarely controlled by shallow forces. That is why the empath often becomes powerful later, not despite the struggle, but because of what the struggle developed. The very experiences that made them feel different, too sensitive, too burdened, were often shaping capacities the world would one day need: discernment, compassion, psychological insight, moral clarity, inner steadiness. These are not accidental traits. These are forged traits. And forged things tend to be stronger than manufactured ones. So if you are in the stage where sensitivity still feels like a burden, understand this: what feels like pain may also be preparation. What feels like isolation may be depth forming. What feels like being misunderstood may be the cost of developing a perception others have not yet grown into. And one day, what once made you feel weak may become the very source of your authority. Because the empath does not become powerful when life stops hurting them. The empath becomes powerful when they realize the pain was teaching them how to see. And once you learn to truly see, very little in this world can control you. There comes a point in the empath's life when exhaustion becomes revelation. And this is a turning point many people never see coming. Because younger empaths often believe love means endless accommodation. They believe being good means always understanding others, always forgiving quickly, always making room for someone else's wounds, moods, or dysfunction. They overextend because they confuse empathy with responsibility. They assume that if they can feel another person's pain, they are obligated to carry it. And for a while, they live this way. They overexplain to people committed to misunderstanding them. They overgive to people who only know how to take. They stay loyal to those who repeatedly violate trust. They tolerate emotional confusion in the name of compassion. And often they do this believing they are preserving peace. But they are not preserving peace. They are financing dysfunction. And sooner or later, reality makes that impossible to ignore. Because emotional overextension always carries a cost. It drains clarity. It erodes self-respect. It creates resentment disguised as patience. And perhaps most dangerously, it teaches others that access to you requires no accountability. Now pay attention, because this is where power begins. Empaths do not usually become bounded because someone taught them healthy boundaries early. They become bounded because betrayal educates them, because repeated exploitation teaches what theory never could, because one day they realize something psychologically profound. Compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. That realization changes everything, because the empath begins separating kindness from submission. This is a massive evolutionary shift. Before this point, they often believe saying no is cruelty. Distance feels like guilt. Silence feels like rejection. Self-protection feels selfish. But maturity exposes the illusion. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls against love. They are structures that make healthy love possible. And once an empath sees this, their entire way of relating changes. They stop answering every emotional demand placed upon them. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to twisting their words. They stop trying to heal people who are invested in remaining wounded. And most importantly, they stop confusing access with intimacy. That distinction is life-changing, because not everyone who has access to you deserves closeness. Not everyone who seeks your energy honors your value. And not everyone who asks for understanding offers reciprocity. Younger empaths often learn this painfully. Older empaths embody it quietly. And this is where a new kind of strength appears. Not dramatic strength. Not aggressive strength, selective strength, measured strength, the power to withhold energy where there is no integrity. That is enormous power, because attention is power. Access is power. Emotional availability is power. And mature empaths stop giving those things away indiscriminately. They become intentional, and intentionality changes how others experience them. Manipulative people often lose interest when empathy gains boundaries. Why? Because exploitation depends on predictability. It depends on knowing you will always over-explain, always return, always forgive without repair, always sacrifice yourself to keep the relationship intact. But boundaries interrupt that script. And once the script breaks, unhealthy dynamics lose their control. This is why people sometimes react negatively when an empath becomes stronger. They say, "You've changed." They don't, that's the point. Growth always looks threatening to those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Remember that. The empath begins to realize peace is not created by keeping everyone comfortable. Peace is created by refusing to participate in what destroys you. That is a profound psychological upgrade, and it often comes with a new understanding of energy itself. Because mature empaths stop treating emotional energy as infinite. They recognize attention is a resource, time is a resource, presence is a resource, and where you place those resources shapes your life. This awareness produces a level of discernment many people never reach. They begin asking different questions. Does this relationship nourish or deplete? Does this person respect limits? Does this dynamic require me to abandon myself to maintain it? Does my compassion here create healing or enable harm? Those are powerful questions. And powerful questions produce powerful lives. Because once you ask them honestly, you stop living reactively. You start living consciously. And conscious living is where power lives. Now something else begins happening. The empath stops needing universal approval. This is enormous because people pleasing is often just the survival strategy of someone afraid of disapproval means danger. But as the empath matures, they begin tolerating something they once feared, being misunderstood. And when you can tolerate being misunderstood without betraying yourself, you become extraordinarily difficult to control because manipulation often works through guilt, through obligation, through fear of appearing harsh. But once those levers stop working, external control weakens. And this is where the empath begins developing